Senator Schmitt, thank you for joining us today. You are, frankly, the biggest champion for free speech in the entire U.S. Senate. And speaking as the Vice President for Free Speech at the Media Research Center, I say this with some authority. But I'll tell you, there's another person who is a competitor of yours for such an accolade, and that is Vice President JD Vance. You both together are amazing advocates for free speech. Why is free speech so important? Why do you and the Vice President spend so much time talking about it?
I think it's, for me, the First Amendment is really the beating heart of the Constitution. It is, there's a reason why it's the First Amendment. It kind of enshrines in our Constitution the right that that we're born with, which is this kind of fundamental human expression, right? To speak our minds. People can't, the government can't tell you what to say or what you can hear or what you can think. And that is, I think, central to the American experiment. Our founders said almost 250 years ago now, 249 years ago in a few days, that everybody in the world previous to the United States founding had it backwards, that our rights don't come from a king or a queen, our rights come from God, and that government's purpose is to protect those God-given rights. And the First Amendment is chief among those. So for me, it's just a very important thing. It's always been important. In fact, when I was growing up, I was always when I was in college, I was always a little bit envious of the Democrats who I felt like they sort of had, this is an iteration of the Democrat Party that's unrecognizable today, but that liberals, Democrats kind of had the high ground on free speech. That's not the case anymore. They've completely abandoned those principles. Even organizations like the ACLU don't really believe that anymore. They believe in power and control and using language as a weapon and controlling language. That's what the whole political correctness movement was about then. It's what DEI to some degree is kind of about now. And for me, I think you just want to have an open dialogue and you combat speech you don't agree with more speech. So these principles are really just sort of undergird the entire country. And it's also, I think, important to note, it's also sort of this pressure release valve. Historically, conflicts, political disagreements are decided by war, by violence. And in this country, we try to take a different path that you would, by allowing people to have even outrageous opinions you don't agree with, there's something cathartic about that. And it's a very important principle.
Yeah, Senator, I'm actually originally from Kansas. Don't hold that against me. I know you Missourians
there's a lot of history there.
There's a lot of history, including burning down some of the Kansas towns.
And Missouri towns, by the way. Don't forget Harrisonville.
It went both ways. But being close to Missouri, back in the 70s and 80s, I knew many people on the left that were very pro-life. But there came a time when people on the left were told, you either become pro-choice or get out of the party. So that's when people like Al Gore and even Jesse Jackson changed their positions on life. And I've seen the same thing now happen with free speech. It used to be the left, as you pointed out, that was so strong about First Amendment free speech rights. And now I can think of one House member who's a Democrat who actually still believes in that traditional view of speech, Ro Khanna of California. Yeah. But I think he's the only one in the House, and there's not a single one of your colleagues in the Senate who actually believes in First Amendment free speech rights. Yeah,
and that became very evident to me when I was Attorney General too. My job that I had before this job, when I was AG, we were the ones we've initiated the lawsuit, Missouri versus Biden, and you got to remember this is before Elon Musk buys Twitter.
Yeah. I just have to interrupt you and say, we never call it Missouri v. Biden. We call it the infamous, the great Missouri v. Biden case that you launched. You launched the single most important action against the Biden administration. I don't think people in America really appreciate what you did to preserve our freedoms. Sorry for interrupting, but I just had to make sure I had that on the record.
I'll start calling it the infamous Missouri versus Biden lawsuit too.
Yes.
Which, by the way, I've got a book out now that is about a lot of these battles against the left, and right in the middle of that is this Missouri versus Biden, later became Murphy versus Missouri, And it's all about sort of what went into that, the thinking, and how we were successful in exposing all of this, the last line of defense. So anyway, the punchline is, before this became mainstream, we just had seen, and I had noticed that the White House, the Biden administration, was talking about these things in a very Orwellian way about, we're flagging this on Facebook and we hope that they're listening. And Biden was threatening them with potential investigations or taking away Section 230 protections. And it just, and then they, of course, I think the straw that broke the camel's back is when they started talking about this Disinformation Governance Board. I mean, in the United States of America, something like that, the Ministry of Truth, I guess, was already taken in 1984, so they decided to call it something else. But you had this Mary Poppins-like figure who was in charge, and their job then, the government's job, was to be the arbiter of what was truth and what was fake information or misinformation or malinformation.
It wasn't about truth. It was about alignment.
Yes, it was about controlling the narrative. And I think, again, the best way to defeat all that is to expose it. And I think the American people at their core reject that, and they don't want the government having that kind of role. But we were, I mean, now that's a little bit in the rearview mirror. It's kind of easy to sort of think, oh, well, that was just, it's I think important for us to remember how close we were to sort of losing all of that, because you had all the sort of weaponization of government going at conservative speech, and they were trying to jail a political opponent. I mean, this stuff was pretty scary stuff.
Yeah, I guess I have to pat ourselves on the back over here at the Media Research Center. We did a big report showing the 57 censorship initiatives across the Biden administration, 93 federal agencies. The Trump administration is using that document to root out censorship. And frankly, only about a third of those Biden initiatives have been eradicated because they're so ingrained. Biden and his team made it part of the blood of that administration. Who was running that whole thing?
It's important work. And I will tell you also, the other thing that came to light, which deserves even more investigation, I think, is not just, so we talked about the First Amendment, how government can't censor speech. The government can't also outsource that to private entities, which is what they were doing with these big tech giants. But the other thing that was nefarious that was happening was they were also working with a lot of these NGOs and a lot of universities. I mean, Stanford, University of Washington, they had their own sort of labs set up to flag this stuff. So it wasn't, somebody in Washington, D.C. doing it, but they had sort of charged these, lefties on the West Coast to do it for them. And then, of course, that entered sort of the whole ecosystem and what Facebook was taking down and what Twitter was throttling and all that sort of stuff. So it was a vast enterprise, is what I sort of referred to as a vast censorship enterprise. Some people called it the censorship industrial complex. Whatever you want to call it, its tentacles were far-reaching and made it even more menacing.
Well, the other thing that takes up so much of my time here at MRC is the rescission package, cutting the funding for PBS and NPR. You have introduced the companion bill. You've introduced a bill in the U.S. Senate to codify Donald Trump's request. Tell me about that. Where do we go? What's going to happen this week in the Senate? Because it's all going to happen fast.
It's going to happen this week, and we have a deadline. The rescissions under the statute that authorizes the rescission process that was authorized in the 70s. We have until Friday to get this done. So we got to get it out of the Senate, back over to the House, all by the end of the week. And I'm very hopeful that we'll be able to do it. I think it's an important part of the president's agenda. I think that when Doge and others were looking at all the waste and the fraud and the abuse and a lot of spending, it's pretty shocking when you see when you've got, Sesame Street in Iraq and Guatemalan sex changes, this stuff is insane. The taxpayers, you just think about it. I just think about where I grew up and how hard, my dad worked 7 days a week in the midnight shift. I had friends, they were truck drivers, they were, cops and firefighters. And you just think about, they're taking that extra overtime shift so their family can maybe go on a vacation that year, or maybe they can, buy a new sofa, or they can send their kid to a different school. Think about how hard they work. That money then comes to Washington, and it's diffused into this radical network of NGOs and others that are doing this ridiculous stuff. It's just really offensive. So we've got a chance to reject that. It's a $9.4 billion rescission. and I think sets the stage for more of those things. And also, once you carve that out for the first time, we look at things in the reconciliation package as a 10-year window. So I don't just look at it as 9.4 billion. I look at it as like potentially over the course of a decade saving $100 billion. And I think that's how we should approach this. But we only need 51 votes in the Senate. We don't need 60 votes, which is the typical threshold for things like this. And so I hope we can take full advantage of that, and we're going to work hard on it this week.
I'm going to ask about that 51st vote in just 1 second, but I do want to make sure that people know that when NPR and PBS and their lobbyists, their $1 million lobbyists, tell people that that NPR and PBS are so needed because of the local news they provide, that's false. NPR, only about 5.4% of its programming is local in orientation. Instead, 95% comes from Washington, D.C., New York City, Boston, and L.A. It is left-wing propaganda. And just last week, you had several senators on the floor saying, look at the Texas floods. This is an example for why we have to have NPR funding because of emergency alerts. Well, Senator, we just broke a story that shows how the NPR stations in Texas, not only did they not run broadcasting about the floods, they didn't break into Morning Edition and their national shows. They instead were spending their time literally lobbying their listeners to call you and your colleagues in the Senate to pressure you to vote against that rescission package. This is 10 hours after the National Weather Service issued its alert on July 3rd. NPR was focused on trying to keep its money, not informing its citizens about the dangers of the flooding.
Yeah, I mean, a few things to unpack there. First thing is, as a parent of kids who would be at the age where they would maybe be at a camp like this, it's excruciatingly painful for those families, and our prayers are with all of them. And it's still unfolding. It's just a terrible, terrible tragedy in the middle of the night. It's just it's a terrible situation. So that's one thing. Second thing is the Democrats' willingness to weaponize this and politicize it within hours is just really sick, and I think speaks to how what terrible position that they're in, that they're glomming on to anything to try to score political points, and they should be ashamed of themselves. And then thirdly, PBS should be too, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, to try to latch on to with taxpayer-funded money to save their hides now when they've been losing the trust of the American people for decades now. Do I like a good Ken Burns documentary from the 90s? Of course. But you know what? It's about 15% of their funding. They can go out and ask their donors who love what they do for more money. They got plenty of time to alter their programming. And the other truth of the matter is this rescissions package doesn't affect any of that. They should be prioritizing their programming for stuff like this, but this is not how that kind of information really gets out there. Nothing touches the FEMA emergency response system, which is how all this stuff is effectively disseminated. And there's a lot of other stations that do this too, so that aren't federally funded. So I just think it's kind of a sad state of affairs where you've got the Corporation for Public Broadcasting using taxpayer money to lobby for more taxpayer funded dollars for their wokeness. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, the law that created NPR and PBS, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, requires, and again, this is the law, it requires NPR and PBS to maintain strict adherence to objectivity and balance of all programming of a controversial nature. They break the law every day. But the law also says that they need to have diverse sources of programming. So they'll have plenty of, say, for-profit programming from the New York Times, Vox, and other left-wing places like The Atlantic. But why do they not have Ben Shapiro on Daily Wire? Why do the NPR stations not broadcast that? There's plenty of right-of-center content that they could get for free instead of having to pay millions of dollars in licensing fees to Boston, and New York, and L.A.
Well, there's a certain amount of arrogance to what they've done too. I mean, their new CEO that they brought on within the last couple of years is someone who's called the president a fascist. I mean, it's just you couldn't have created a caricature of someone more kind of out of touch. The stereotype of what a person, like sort of the wokest of the woke in the woke army, might woke like, that's her.
Yeah.
Like, that's her. And she's in front of Congress trying to explain herself for these crazy tweets. So anyway, this is not, to me, this isn't difficult. It's not complicated. You're a totally biased news organization and you don't deserve, you can still exist, but you just shouldn't get taxpayer money. That's all.
We just need 51 votes. And as I count noses on this, I think we will need the vice president for that 51st vote. So I want to ask you a couple questions about the vice president. If you and the vice president were on a golf course, 18 holes, what's the over-under on this between you two guys?
Oh man, I'm not going to throw my good friend JD Vance under the bus here. What are you doing? But I mean, I wouldn't. What self-respecting golfer wouldn't bet on himself? So, and I'm a competitive guy, but he's a good golfer. But the most important thing here is that we have a lot of fun. And I told people this before Vice President Vance was ever selected. He and I came into the Senate together at the same time. And it's just a pretty unique experience when you come in as a freshman with other freshmen. It's just it's a very unique life experience, right? And you share that with very few people on the planet. And Vice President Vance and I got to know each other, similar backgrounds, shared values. He's just a regular guy. He's a good guy. He's a family guy. We just share a lot of and our worldviews very much aligned. That doesn't hurt. But on a personal level, he's just become a very good friend. And so when you can kind of spend some time on a golf course with a friend for 3 or 4 hours, and it's a lot of fun when we get a chance to do it. Wish we could do it more.
Now, I think you've also been golfing with the president.
I have, and there's no question who would win that. That's President Trump. So let's be clear, President Trump is a better golfer. I'm not making this up. Like, he's a good golfer. I don't think I've ever seen him miss a fairway off the tee. And his short game is really good. So, we usually team up. I played a few weeks ago. I was playing with the CIA director, John Radcliffe, against President Trump and a couple other senators that will remain nameless. And President Trump alone, not the other senators, certainly had our number that day. So
yeah, I don't golf. I used to run for Kansas University, Rock Chalk Jayhawk. Yeah, I was a middle distance runner.
I played a lot of sports, football and baseball and basketball, and I liked running when it was for a purpose in a sport. I've never been a runner just to run, so I admire people who do that because there's a certain amount of discipline. I think that you force yourself to run 13 miles without, you're not trying to score a touchdown or on a fast break.
You're a pretty big guy. What are you, 6'4", 6'5"?
6'6".
6'6". You're kind of big to be a runner. I think you should stick to basketball and football.
I shouldn't be a wrestler either. Mark Lane Mullen thinks he's a good athlete, and I tell him you're just a good wrestler. So
yeah, nobody ever called a runner an athlete. We were always just called runners.
No, that's not true. I could. There's good runners or athletes, but it's a different skill. And I've the guys that I grew up with who did cross country, I just always thought that was pretty amazing. To like every day you're running like 10, 12 miles. That's wild.
Yeah. It was rough. It was rough. But I want to get back to policy.
How are your knees, by the way? I feel like how are you dealing with? Do you have knee issues now that you're older?
I have. My knees and hips have done well. Okay. It's my lower back. That's where I've really paid the price from running. I'm literally about 1.5 inches shorter now than I was back as a runner. That pounding takes a toll on joints. It does.
Yeah.
But Senator, I got to say that you and the president, and I know that you had a lot of influence on some of these appointments, have found some excellent people for the administration. The Federal Trade Commission, Andrew Ferguson, is exceptional. Gail Slater at the Antitrust Division, exceptional. I assume you were working with them when you were, before you were elected to the Senate, when you were in the Senate, and now that they are in the administration. I assume that there's a lot of talk among all three of you on what to do with Google and Amazon, and these big tech platforms. What are we going to do to rein in the abuse that Americans have suffered at their hands?
I think, when I was Attorney General, I had joined some antitrust litigation, particularly against Google. I think Google You know, the social media companies get a lot of attention, and a lot of that was because of the censorship that we saw and working with the Biden administration. And, you know, Mark Zuckerberg became kind of a lightning rod for that and finally sort of admitted what was going down there. But Google, you know, if you're and you and I have talked about this. If you're on page 5, not page 1, and that's a black box, nobody really knows why. You know, that can destroy your business. And, you know, there have been Republicans who run for office who are much more well-known and well-financed. And if you search their name, they'll be on page 3, but the Democrats on page 1. Some of these things just don't make a lot of sense unless the algorithm's rigged. And so I think writ large, these big tech companies, many of them just need to be busted up. And I think that's the way forward. And I think that some of that litigation is headed in that direction, but we'll see. So, but yeah, I agree with you. The president has put together, and not just that, you know, you mentioned some people that aren't like, you know, high profile first month of nominations and confirmations, but across the board, I think President Trump, in a weird way, having the non-consecutive term, you know, coming in after 4 years after being in office, he kind of was able, I think, to really look around and figure out who he wanted to be in that foxhole with him, people he trusted, respected, who were aligned. And I just think it's a tremendous, tremendous cabinet. And then you get into those other positions like deputy of whatever or assistant whatever. Just the roster is very, very deep for this kind of America First agenda.
Yeah, Senator, I know we need to wrap this up, but I just have one more question for you. Yeah, when we first started talking here, you articulated a view of government that is identical to mine, and your priority on free speech is identical to mine. How did you get involved in policy issues? How did you decide to get into this fight to protect our American values and our American lifestyle?
I grew up in a working class family in a working class neighborhood. My dad, I mentioned my dad. My dad worked 7 days a week in the midnight shift. And so my dad actually would be home in the evenings before he would go to work. And so that gave him, he would go to my ball games or, you know, just he would be around or dinner or whatever. And I remember I would watch like CNN Crossfire, and Pat Buchanan was somebody that really appealed to me at a young age. Jack Kemp was a guy. These are like people who were speaking the language of the neighborhood I lived in, but they were Republicans. And so I think for me, that, and I loved Ronald Reagan. My dad loved Reagan. And so that at an early age kind of, I guess, gave me a little bit of a framework on how to view things. But so I was interested, but running for office is a whole different thing. Like that wasn't on my radar. I was a lawyer, and I was just starting a family, and I just made partner, and that was all moving along. And then my son, Stephen, was born in 2004. He was born with a rare genetic condition that is manifested in, you know, brain tumors and epilepsy and autism, and he's nonverbal. Stephen's 20 now. But going through all that and watching him go through that, including a 4-hour seizure one time, and then being in the ICU for, you know, over a week after that, I kind of went through this process of discernment of like, what do you really want to do with your life? And for me, I wanted to do more than what I was doing before, and for that became public service for me. And so I kind of threw myself into that and fought for the things I believed in, that fighting for individuals with disabilities is something that doesn't get as much press maybe as some of the free speech stuff, but it's very important to me. And then I could never have imagined when I made that decision that I'd be here. And so I approach it with a lot of humility and gratitude, and just want to make the most of the opportunity.
Senator, you're a huge champion at the Media Research Center. You know, you're on our top shelf of public servants. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for everything you do for America and for our individual rights.